All right, welcome. Today we are going to interview an LDS horror author. C. David Belt wrote The Sweet Sister, which I had the honor to beta read, and then also picked up the finished novel and find him quite fascinating. And LDS horror as a genre is a rather interesting thing as well. So, Dave, why don't you give us a little introduction on how you came to write LDS horror and why this genre?
Well, I came up with an idea, really was possessed by an idea for a vampire novel, a vampire story, but I have never been comfortable with the idea of involuntary eternal damnation. That's the one aspect of the popular vampire myth that bothered me the most. The problem was I was trying very hard not to write it as an LDS story, and it would never quite gel in my head because it's so bound up in the idea of the atonement and agency and forgiveness, and I just couldn't separate it quite in my head. So I made the main character the unwilling vampire. That's what I want to do. I want to tell a story about the world's only unwilling vampire, where vampirism has to be a choice because you're choosing to become a serial killer. No animal blood cop out, like we've heard about in some popular books and movies, which we won't mention, at least not here. And but you have to choose it. Only he didn't, and he's the only one. And I couldn't quite get that worked out in my head until I made him LDS. And when I did and set it, in Utah, boom, it came together. I mean, literally in a year, I had the first volume of my Children of Lilith trilogy, and it was about a year for each one after that. It took me about a year to find a publisher, which I was very surprised at. Shouldn't have been that quick on a first novel. But yeah, I just like the idea of taking a good LDS person who is struggling to keep their covenants and slamming them up the side of the head with something that challenges their faith and rocks it to the core. Now, it may not be so much a crisis of faith, but a crisis of how do you go on doing the right thing when you're not even sure that God is still there anymore, or that you have progressed so far that you can't conceive of redemption. And that was what led me to LDS horror. Now, it goes more religious, less religious, but it's still all about a good LDS person having their faith rocked. And you see we all have the story, and we hear it all the time about the little boy who and his sister that go into the hospital, and the doctor comes to him and says, "Your sister needs a blood transfusion." And so the little boy gives his blood, and then the doctor comes in later and finds the little boy lying on his bed crying because he thinks he's going to die. And every time we hear that story, I tear up and I go, "Oh, I love that story." But I'm not really listening anymore because I know the story. I'm waiting for whoever's telling it to get to their point. So LDS horror is taking a story and or taking a good LDS person and putting them in a position that is just a wee bit outside the norm. And I'm telling the same story, only you're listening because it's different.
Well, I have to admit, I really loved that element, both as an LDS person, but just as a writer, I found it really fascinating to take two things that don't seem to go together, and then you blended them so well, in that it created these really interesting and complex about why do we do the things we do? Why might religion be necessary? I found myself thinking at a deeper philosophical level than I expected when I picked up a book that mostly I was fascinated because there was this awesome death tree, but I really enjoyed brought together as well. So I'm wondering if you could tell just a little bit about the research that you tend to do for a novel or even a short story, because I loved your short story that was in the Mind Games anthology for LDS beta readers. That was also fascinating.
Thank you. Well, the last thing in the world I want a reader to do is read something that I've written, however fantastic, and say, that's not right. It doesn't happen that way. That isn't real life. And so if it's something I know well, I'm very comfortable. My vampire protagonist, my unwilling vampire, was a video game programmer who used to be a B-52 pilot in the United States Air Force. I was very comfortable writing about that because that's me. But a 270-year-old Scottish vampire, I had to research everything. I'm trying to find out about childbirthing and midwifing practices in the 18th century. I'm very blessed to be in the Mormon Tabernacle Choir because I'm surrounded by experts on just about everything. Not midwifing in the 18th century. I had a friend who's an old flight surgeon of mine back when I was in the Air Force. He loves medical history. I mean, is in the history of medicine. So I did my research, and then I went to him and said, okay, tell me what I've got wrong here. And I said, I don't have to have all the details right, but every detail I mention has to be right. And he said, well, do you know they used to dry the babies in saltpeter? And I said, I saw something about that. He says, that's a detail that will catch their eye, but it's absolutely true. And I said, okay. And then, so I research something I don't know. And then I usually go to several sources, and then I drill down and I drill down and I drill down. And like I say, I don't have to mention everything that I find. Trust me, I'm just scratching the surface. It has to be accurate. I'm talking about temple divorces and annulments and clearances and how that works. Well, it's not something I'm an expert on. So I talk to a lot of stake presidents and former stake presidents and people. I had a friend who used to write the policy manuals, the priesthood manual, not the manual of procedures. You know, the handbook. That's what I'm looking for. He authored parts of that. And so I went to him and I said, okay, what do I need to know? And here's what I want to present. Does this work? If this doesn't work, then tell me and we'll write something else. Or let's say we're talking about, oh, this was one, DNA testing. I went to a friend of mine who is a vice detective. Really nice guy. In the field, he's one of the scariest dudes you will ever meet. And I said, okay, well, I need to know about this. Where can I hide a body? Where will it never be found around here? And so he told me. And I said, okay, what happens when people are arrested for assault in the streets? And you know, what do the cops do? What do the detectives do, and so on? And then I said, okay, tell me about DNA testing. He said, well, I said, how long did it take it to get a DNA test back? And I said, he says, on what? I said, blood with stomach fluids in it. And he said, interesting. And he came back and said, well, a minimum of a month, maybe 6 months. However, if you're in a military database, bingo, my character is ex-military. His DNA's on record. We can get it back in 24 hours. So I get a reviewer who says that's CSI stuff. You know, that on TV, that doesn't happen. And I said, I specifically mentioned he was in a military database, and I specifically mentioned that's the only reason they got the results back that quickly. And then I went back to another source and I asked, am I right about that? And they said, oh yeah. So 6 ways to Sunday.
Well, that's interesting. So now I don't have to be as annoyed by NCIS and how quickly they can get DNA databases, DNA information.
You're in a federal database. If you're in a federal database, they can get it back quickly. If not, nope.
Not happening. All right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I remember we were in a chat somewhere online, probably at LDS beta readers, and you even mentioned how much time you had spent looking at some of these rituals that I had assumed you had just made up off the top of your head, and all of a sudden realized that you had even built some levels of history and research into the horror elements that you were bringing into the book.
Okay, so let me tell you a story. This is a really cool story. All right. So I am at, when I get stuck on something, I find that going to Tabernacle Choir rehearsals or the broadcasts in the morning clears my head and inspiration comes. All right, so this is a weird story, but I was really struggling with how to present a grisly human sacrifice. I didn't want to give you the details. I had to give you all the details, but I wanted to present them in a manner that wouldn't make my mother uncomfortable. So, because there are lines I just don't want to cross. Yes, I'm writing horror. Yes, I write about people who do terrible things, but I want to talk about it in a way that you can read it, say, but go on. So I was really struggling with how to do this human sacrifice. And I knew that there were 2 elements to it that were really bad. And I was struggling with that. And I went to choir, and I'm staring off into that space, the tabernacle, and all of a sudden it came to me. I knew exactly how to tell the part of the story without crossing those lines, but it came to me there was something missing. There was a 3rd element to this sacrifice that involved hitting the person on the head. It's called the triple death by the Romans who documented it. So I'm leaving choir and I'm walking out, and another choir member, baritone, says, "How you doing, Dave?" And I said, "I'm doing great. I know how to describe that grisly human pagan sacrifice now." And I got home and I wrote it up. And then I'm doing research, continuing to do research on this period, what the Romans said. And then all of a sudden I came across an article about a perfectly preserved body from the very period, the very incidents I'm talking about, preserved in a bog so well that that they knew what the guy ate for dinner, his clothing was intact, everything about it. And he had gone to his death willingly. They were able to determine that. There was no sign of struggle, but his hands weren't bound, for example. But he had all 3 gory elements of the triple death, just as the Romans described it. Now, I had read that this was assumed to be Roman propaganda, justification for invasion and colonization and putting down those horrible pagan people. And there's another part in that book that you're talking about, another ritual that is quite horrible that involves fire. And I had to figure out how to describe that. That was described by the Romans, and for a very long time, it was assumed to be propaganda. And then we found the evidence of that ritual. And that just sent a chill up my spine. Now, the book hadn't come out, but I was just intent on getting all the details right and making sure that my mom could read it.
And that's an incredible trick. So as we wind this down, why don't you tell my viewers, forget what I'm doing today, but tell the viewers a little bit about your most recent novel and kind of what you would hope they would take away from it after reading it.
Well, my most recent one is called The Sweet Sister, as you mentioned. It is a story of Peggy Carson, and on the cover, there's this woman with half of her face is badly deformed, and there's two gigantic black dogs and two gigantic black birds on her shoulder, and I always say that's not Peggy Carson, but let's get that out of the way. Peggy Carson is 30 years old. She's very smart. She's very funny. She's very geeky. She's very sweet. And she's very plain. And she's desperately in love with her coworker, Derek, who's 26 years old and gorgeous. They do everything together. They go to Comic-Con and Renaissance fairs, and they watch Doctor Who together, and they don't laugh at the silly bits, although they may smile knowingly. And he has no idea that she's in love with him. And because of where they work, Derek has discovered a series of 6 diaries, all written in the same handwriting, all by the same young woman. And they tell a similar story. Pretty Elaine arrives in the spring. She is in love with the trees and the flowers and the birds and the animals and sunrise and sunsets, life in general. She meets the young man. They get engaged. They fall in love. They get engaged. And in the fall, the diary just abruptly ends. And the diaries are spaced exactly 60 years apart, period spanning centuries. Derek believes he has discovered a time-traveling fairy tale princess, but a princess under an evil curse, because wherever Elaine appears, her disfigured older sister Morghese appears, and wherever Elaine and Morghese appear, people die horribly. Now, because of where he works, Derek knows that the time 60 years are up. He knows where she will appear. He even has the address, and it's in Mapleton, Utah. And he is determined to ride in like a knight in shining armor and break the curse and rescue the princess and defeat the evil queen / witch, or whatever you want to think of her as. And Peggy asks, oh, what happens to the boyfriends? There's always a boyfriend. Now, an ancient evil has awoken out of the mists of time, and it has begun to stalk Peggy. And even if she can save Derek, which she will do at any cost, who will save her? Now, what do I want you to get out of this book? You know, I don't start necessarily with a moral or a lesson in mind, but what stuck to me was a scene where Peggy realizes that Derek is not going to listen to her. He doesn't love her. He will never love her. And he's chosen a fairy tale girl over her that he barely knows. And she's devastated. And it's this time that her father, who's serving a mission as a mission president in Ukraine, calls her and says, your mother had a dream. Peggy's in trouble. Now, what can I do for you, girl? What do you need? I don't need you to come, Daddy. Oh, I'm not coming. That's not what the Spirit's telling me. What do you need? Is it this Derek? And she said, how do you know about Derek? Well, it's only you ever talk about, so on. And he says to her, you are more than what he sees. You are more than what anyone sees. Don't ever forget that. And if anything comes out of that book, it's that. You are more than what people see.
I think that's a beautiful moral to a spine-tingling novel that also had a lot of heart. And I really hope any of the viewers will take the time to check this out, whether they are LDS or not. Oh, yeah. There's really interesting cultural elements that you would pick up reading this, especially about how a religion views light and dark, and what those beliefs about things like atonement or our belief in the ability of people to change, and how that could apply to even the worst of circumstances. So really quick, give the 2-minute spiel for what's coming next for you, and then we'll wrap on up.
Oh, well then, okay. Well, next fall, September, Time's Plague, A Tale in 5 Acts comes out. And Time's Plague is my first science fiction novel. And it is with a Shakespearean bent, the story of an LDS man who is convicted of a murder he didn't commit. He's framed by his best friend / business partner, the cargo master on the interplanetary freighter that he owns and captains, and his wife, his now ex-wife, who is now married to the business partner. There's a strong tie into Shakespeare and King Lear. He is put onto this moon where there's a prison colony. It's only for men. Women can't live on this moon of Jupiter. The first colonists that arrived, all the women got sick. And before they could be evacuated, remember, this isn't Star Trek. The only reason they were able to be evacuated at all was because a second wave of colonists arrived a few weeks later. Before they could be evacuated, 80% of the women and girls died. And no one has figured out why. However, you've got this colony that men can live in. So they dump off all the murderers and rapists. And he is put in this place. There's no parole, no judge, no warden, nothing. There's a doctor, an android doctor, who stays behind an airlock in the sick bay. But prisoners are dropped from orbit. There's no appeal. There's no communication with the outside. Nothing. Sentences are for life. And so he's thrown into this horrible situation, and he's innocent. In fact, his state president, they hold the disciplinary council and they take no action. What this means is they're determining that he is innocent of what he's been convicted of. And he arrives with his priesthood intact. Not that there's a lot he can do with it, but his priesthood's intact. And he's immediately savagely beaten, assaulted. Remember, this stuff happens off camera, but it happens in prisons. His throat is cut. He barely survives, but he finds a way to survive. And then these men start coming to him, these murderers and rapists, who say, "You're one of these Christians. You can lead us. I can't baptize you. I can't do any of this stuff. But you can lead us." And then there's a ship that crash lands, a shuttle that crash lands. The first one to do so since the prison was established. There is one survivor, his ex-wife. She is blinded, and she has no idea who this scarred, rough-voiced man is. And he can either give her to the prisoners, which he thinks about doing but can't do, or he can figure out some way to get her off world. Because if he doesn't, she will die of the female plague. But he desperately needs to know why. Why did you betray me? And he doesn't let her know who he is, and he badgers her. He pretends to be insane and all this fun stuff. Shakespearean stuff. Anyway.
Well, I will definitely be checking that out. And I want to thank you for being here tonight and letting us know a little bit about you and what you write. And I hope that there are plenty more books coming from you.
I have one that I'm almost done with. The Witch of White Lady Hollow.
I'm excited about that one. I think I read that first chapter a while ago. So
now the first chapter was to hook you, but it's not what the book's about.
Typically isn't. So anyway, thank you so much, Dave. It was fantastic chatting with you, and I hope to do it again in the future.
Thank you. That'd be great.
All right. Signing off, guys. Go find some books and be nice and scared. Hide under your covers tonight.